presentation in honor of Women's History Month. And just to give us all a quick background, for the Women's History Month is for the purpose of commemorating and encouraging the study, observance, and celebration of the role of women in Minnesota history. Or, sorry, Minnesota. We will be talking about Minnesota, but American history. Um, and what I hope to achieve with this presentation is to highlight women's history, but to highlight Black women's history in a city that often overlooks that. So hopefully we'll be able to encourage that today, or to do that today. Nellie Francis Griswold and Ethel Ray Nance um, both had a mentor ship with W.E.B. Du Bois. Some of you know him as W.E.B. Du Bois. Historians say that a number of ways. And why I'm mentioning this person when we're talking about women is he is a good person to highlight what was going on at this period in the time. Most importantly, the paper I'm writing focuses on how both Nellie and Ethel fit into um, the talented 10th model for Black uplift. So let's talk about that really quickly. Dubois' theory about the talented 10th first came to the public attention through an anthology of essays called The Negro Problem, published in 1903. So this anthology was published by Dubois' rival Booker T. Washington. And what the talented 10th meant to Dubois was that educated men and women of the Black race specifically would be in charge of uplifting the whole race and the nation at large. So, this is a little excerpt from the Negro Problem um, from Du Bois' essay. So, the Negro race, like all races, is going to be saved by exceptional men. The problem of education, then, among Negroes must first of all deal with the talented tenth. It is the problem of developing the best of this race, that they may guide the mass away from the contamination and death of the worst in their own races. So, obviously, this leaves out a couple of classes of people, and as we'll talk about, this is something that Dubois turned away from later in his life. And to really connect Dubois to women, and these women we're going to speak about, I wanted to show you guys another excerpt. This one is from Dark Water, and that was Dubois' literary work. And in it, he states, as I look about me today in the veiled world of mine, despite the noisier and more spectacular advance of my brothers, I instinctively feel and know that that it is the 5 million women of my race who really count. So again, Du Bois putting emphasis on the Black woman and her importance on the, again, uplift is this term that's really used in the 20th century when it comes to race leaders and usually referred to as race men. So the uplift of Black people in America. And what that means is social and civil equality and legal equality. We have to also keep in mind that Jim Crow is rising at this point as well. And before we get to Nellie and Ethel, I also want to touch really quickly on how Dubois saw his place among the women's right to vote, so suffrage. So this is important to know just because um, we need this background before we get into their lives just so we know what was going on. Obviously in the early 20th century, so early 1900s, women were agitating for the right to vote, and Dubois, unlike other Black and white men, were in favor of giving the right to vote to women. He did see two problems he needed to address. One was white suffragists and how they wanted to disconnect the fight for the right to vote from the needs of Black men. So instead of the vote being universal, meaning Black people, Black women, Black men, white women, white suffragists started to stop supporting the right for black men to vote because they were fearful that, and again, not everyone was fearful, but some sections of this movement were fearful that black men would get the right to vote before white women would. So that was one of the challenges he addressed in a couple of articles in his magazine, The Crisis. And and I'll touch on the crisis again, but the crisis was formed as an organ or mouthpiece of the NAACP by Du Bois. Um, and then the other part of Du Bois' support for the right for women to vote is enfranchisement of black women. So he really felt that if we focused on black women as well, what we would do is set up a good voting block in the northern states. And then from there, northern blacks would support women through a state referendum, state by state. And then from there, he reasoned that the referendums could lead to a change in the political power in those regions and could eventually lead to the enfranchisement of black women in the South. So what he's saying is twofold. We need the support of white suffragists, and we need to talk about how critical it is to get black women the right to vote as well. Um, so, with that background on Du Bois, and before we turn to Nellie and Ethel Ray Nance, um, I need for us to all keep in mind that this presentation I'm about to give you about these two women is more about their relationship to Du Bois because I want to again highlight their role in the Talented Tenth or how they related to his mentor. Here are these two black women from Minnesota, which I think I need to hammer on a little bit because I kind of glossed over that in the beginning. But two black women from Minnesota who were um, getting guidance and also giving guidance to one of the most, or the most, I guess you could argue, famous sociologists and black historian or American historians, really, of the 20th century. And some of you who are maybe watching C.J. Madden Walker's story, I believe on Netflix, may have seen him introduced as a character, but again, maybe some of you are already familiar. So please keep in mind that we're going to give a little background about Nellie and Ethel, and it's going to be very introductory, and it's going to be tied to what were these women's role in terms of this black leadership that was forming in the 20th century, early 20th century. So with that, let's start with Nellie Griswold Francis. So this PowerPoint, or sorry, this slide is um, background on some of her work here in the States. So I'll keep that up while I'll give you guys a little biographical information. So Nellie is not a Minnesota native. She was born in Nashville in 1874. Her family did move to Minnesota in the late 1800s, and she attended St. Paul Central High School, or what is now known as St. Paul Central High School. She was asked to give the commencement speech at her graduation because of how successful she was in high school here. And during that commencement, she read a paper that she wrote called "The Race Problem," or what we have, or what have some, or what some people have called the first paper ever read on that subject. That subject meaning race in Minnesota. She was the only black graduate that year in 1891. So Nellie graduates from high school 1891. And then in her adult life, she marries William Francis. So, why do I want to talk about this very educated, capable woman and talk about her husband? Well, it goes back to this ideal of the talented 10th and respectability politics of the early 20th century. So, what do we mean by respectability politics? Um, so, just to kind of try to parse it in a nutshell, it's kind of a standard that a lot of Black leaders wanted to live up to in order to kind of achieve parity and equality with white counterparts. And it's a part of this, again, struggle for civil rights in the early 20th century. Now, it's controversial because respectability politics include things like being married, having a certain type of education, and these things blend well with this talented 10th ethos. So she was married to William Francis. William was a lawyer here in Minnesota. He was a railroad lawyer, to be exact. And, this offered him a certain amount of status in Black Minnesota circles here in the earliest 20th century. He was well educated. And he graduated in 1904 from the St. Paul College of Law, which is now Mitchell Hamlin School of Law, for those of you who might be familiar. And if you look at both of them, if you look at the photos of both of them, you can tell that they're very light in complexion. So, why do I talk about this? This issue of colorism comes up too. Uh, Sadly, and this is kind of a holdover from colonialism and slavery, this connection to whiteness kind of makes your whole being more palatable to um, white people in society in the early 20th century. So a lot of these quote unquote race leaders, and you could definitely count Nellie in that as well, were lighter. And again, this is not anything to criticize Nellie about. It's just that we have to be um, aware of these kind of racial blocks that we had, and then also how that contributed to how we interacted with people. So, and we'll see a little later how she was able to do certain things, most likely because of her complexion. However, we can't discredit how well educated and successful she was. So William, after establishing a good law practice here in Minnesota, is actually appointed by President Calvin Coolidge to become a minister resident or consul general to Liberia. So Nellie and William do move later to take up that job. So let's talk about Nellie's background here in Minnesota. So Nellie was the president of the Minnesota State Federation of Colored Women. So what does that mean? In 1905, Ione Gibbs founded the Minnesota Federation of Colored Women's Clubs, originally represented by 12 social clubs. So when I say social clubs, what do I mean early 20th century? These usually were organized or sorry made up of women. Um, Black women and white women usually had separate clubs, but that's not always the case. And sometimes these clubs focused on different issues depending on the club, but generally it's social issues, um, helping people in the community, providing childcare for certain people, and then also obviously agitating for the right to vote for women. So it could be a range of um, initiatives that they implemented. So this particular federation added to their state slogan, "Our men, women, and children," to their national motto. So again, it's a focus on how do we uplift everyone in the community, whether that be providing resources that they need and education, and also maybe even fighting for supporting certain legislation. Um, and one prime example of the Minnesota Federation of Colored Women's initiatives and how they supported the community at large was they really took an interest in aiding the Crispus Attucks home here in Minnesota. And the Crispus Attucks home was a historic, I guess you could say, organization that provided housing for older Black Minnesotans and children as well. It's no longer existing now. So the role of the women in this club was social. Um, Nellie also led the Every Woman Social Club that focused on the right to vote for women. She was also a stenographer for the Western Publishing Company. So that company is a law book publishing, or was, operated in downtown St. Paul starting in 1876. It had a couple of different lives throughout the decades. And so, what do we mean by stenographer? Stenographer is someone who takes notes shorthand. So, she was taking shorthand notes for lawyers at the company. Really, something else that's interesting to note is she actually worked as a stenographer at the Great Northern Railroad Company, and that was the transcontinental railroad system built and extended by James J. Hill here in St. Paul. And that line went from St. Paul to Seattle. So I'm sure some of you are very familiar with the James J. Hill House and a little bit of his work. So there's some kind of connection between Nellie and James J. Hill as well. She also served two times as a delegate to state suffrage conferences here in the state. Um, Really interesting, she ran the press office for the National Association of Colored Women's Club. So this is a national club, and it's interesting to note because again, this kind of pops up on Self-Made, the CJ Madam Walker story, or Madam CJ Walker story on Netflix. So, and I'm just pointing this out just because that's kind of in the news right now, and people are tuning into it. You can take that for what it is. Some people loved that um, show, some people did not, and I get why. But just so again, we're trying to connect these women's lives uh, in the state, but also nationally too. And then the thing that Nellie is most famous for, if people are a little bit familiar with her, is her 1921 anti-lynching legislation. So, let's give a little background on why that was necessary for people who are either new to Minnesota or maybe haven't heard of this before. So on June 15th, 1920, three black men were lynched in Duluth, Minnesota. Elias Clayton, Elmer Jackson, and Isaac McGee were accused of physical and sexual assault by two teens. So as the word of the assault or supposed assault grew, and then a mob was forming. They were placed in a Duluth jail, um, but that did not stop the mob from getting to them. Um, the mob stormed the jail. Or sorry, yes, the mob stormed the jail and stripped all the men of all their clothing, and actually publicly hung them. So at this time, at that exact moment, Duluth didn't have its own NAACP. So the NAACP did try to send a couple of lawyers to Duluth to defend the men before their hanging. Obviously, that didn't uh, happen. Um, and because of that, no one was ever convicted of the lynchings, and obviously, the three men weren't given um, a fair trial. So, um, and that's something, AICM may touch in the future, and I'm just giving a quick background on that. So obviously, Nellie and William, her husband, were both shocked at the brutality of their fellow Minnesotans. Um, when they were reading magazines like The Crisis, they were reading about these lynchings happening in the South, and there was this ideal that they would be protected in the North, and I'm sure that was a blow to them. So Nellie took it upon herself to write some legislation for obviously trying to outlaw lynching in Minnesota. So again, the lynching happened in 1920, and in 1921, her legislation passed. Um, and I'll read a letter from Dubois congratulating her on getting that work done. Sadly, Nellie and William weren't spared, even though, we were talking about colorism earlier and how they were lighter and how they were maybe able to navigate um, American society a little easier. But that's not always the case. And 3 years after her anti lynching legislation passed, Nellie and William were interested in buying a house in St. Paul. And for those who are familiar, I can give you the address in case you want to Google map. But so at 2092 Sargent Avenue in St. Paul. Um, but in response, their neighbors organized the Cretan Improvement Association, which you could imagine what improvements they would want to make there. But basically, they held noisy demonstrations, threatened the couple, and even offered them thousands of dollars to not move in. The real kicker is having a cross burned on their lawn. So, um, that's Nellie in a nutshell here in Minnesota. And as you can see from the background that I just gave, one, she really did fit into this ideal of the talented 10th, or someone who would be educated enough, persuasive enough to help uplift other Black folks who were struggling, maybe financially and especially socially and legally in Minnesota and across the nation. So she fits this talented 10th mold. She's also married. She's a quote unquote respectable woman. And so after her legislation passed, and this is where the letters come in from Dubois. Dubois had already had a relationship with her husband William, and so naturally that social relationship developed with Nellie as well. And in some letters previous to the one I'm about to read, Nellie was actually talking to Dubois about her legislation, and he encouraged her to get some rest. And in response, on May 13th, 1921, Dubois wrote, I'm sorry, Nellie writes to Dubois, "My dear Mr. Dubois, have both letters prescribing rest and more rest. Billy has now laid me to rest, which I hope will be to your supreme satisfaction, as it is to his. We are having Florence Cole Talbot with us next Thursday night to lull me to rest. Can she do it? Will you please write me return mail for use and help to yours truly at a big disarmament meeting next week at our auditorium next Friday. What you consider the most valued disarmament argument from our viewpoint. I'd like to add a quote unquote color scheme to the meeting. Just state it about 2 or 3 sentences and let me have it by return mail. The folks all send love to you and Mrs. Dubois. Yours sincerely and waitingly, in quotes, Nellie F. So, two things about, or actually maybe three things about this letter. Nellie kind of brushes off Dubois' concerns of rest. You need to rest. Um, and ask him for more information. So it's really interesting because she's saying, in the previous letter he had congratulated her, but she's saying she wants to take more on. So she's showing herself as a real quote unquote race woman or leader. And those of you probably wondering about the disarmament, um, in that year, 1921, um, the Washington Conference, or that you might see it's written as the Washington Naval Conference, happened. And so again, this is post World War One. So this was aimed at limiting naval arms race. And it seems like from Nellie's letter, they were having a local meeting before the national one. And what she wanted to do in terms of the color scheme was maybe even talk about treatment of black troops after the war. And I'm sure that was on both their minds at that time. And one more letter kind of hints at their social um, relationship. So this one is to Nellie from Dubois. Just to set it up a little bit, Nellie had previously written Dubois asking if she could be in the spring garden contest, and we'll talk about what that is. So, Dubois to Nellie. My dear Nellie, I'm very sorry to hear of the death of Lulu. I had not known it before. The spring garden contest closed April 15th, so that is too late to enter anything for that. But I should be glad to read anything that you write with the view of a possible publication in the Crisis. I shall be in California in the West from May 15th until July. Sincerely yours, WEBD. So, couple things to note about that letter. The Spring Garden Contest was something that was created in the Crisis, again, the magazine for the NAACP. And Nellie wanted to submit a literary piece for that. So she knew she could count on her mentor, Dubois, to help her. And maybe she was even asking for a little favor since she wasn't able to get in on that April 15th deadline. Um, so it seems like in later letter that we're not going to read now, Dubois was kind of being quote unquote hard boiled and was not letting her sneak in under the deadline, but was actually asking her if she could submit it to the crisis. Again, showing much respect from this woman or for this woman from Minnesota and trying to help her out because he knew her socially. He also knew her to be quite capable um, professionally as well. And, appearing in the crisis would be probably an honor for Nellie as well. And, I just wanted to read a few, two letters from Dubois to Nellie. And and I'll give everyone a link later. I'll email it to people who signed up. But these letters come from digital archives at the University of Elmhurst. And when you read the letters between Nellie and Dubois, you get a sense more that they had a socially connected relationship, meaning whenever they traveled, they always would write each other and say, "Hey, I'm in New York," or "Hey, I'm here. Let's connect," or talk about the people in their society and who they knew and who each should meet and talk to. And now, with that, we're going to switch to Ethel Ray Nance, who had a way different relationship with Dubois than Nellie. Nellie was kind of respectability politics personified, and Ethel Ray Nance was a little different. So let's give a little background on Ethel. Again, the slide's gonna we'll get to all those little things I have up there. Let me give you some background. So Ethel is actually a Minnesota native, and we'll see there are certain ways that she fit into the talented 10th. And this information I'm getting from a taped interview from the Minnesota Black History Project created by the Minnesota Historical Society, where Ethel actually gives an oral history interview so you can actually read the transcripts and listen to that too. So, little background on Ethel. So, she was born in Duluth, Minnesota in 1899 to her parents, who one was an immigrant from Varmland, Sweden, and the other was a black man from North Carolina. So, again, if we're talking about colorism, and you can see in this photo, she's a bit light as well. And so, again, if we're imagining this ideal, which again isn't necessarily true of the talented 10th, she would kind of fit there. Although, obviously, there are plenty of people who are leaders um, who fit the talented entity who weren't. Again, this is just mentioning colorism to show how people navigated society. Um, and her father was actually, and we talked about the Duluth lynching a little bit when we talked about Nellie, but um, Ethel's father actually witnessed the lynching. At that time, when the lynching happened, Ethel was off doing forestry work, and we'll talk about that a little later, in the Moose Lake area. But her father was on his way to work the day after the lynching and actually saw the bodies after they had been cut down from the telegraph pole that they were hung from. So her father was very obviously affected by this. He was already reading The Crisis again, which had talked about lynchings and ways to counter that in the US. And he actually, according to Ethel, started the NAACP chapter in Duluth after those lynchings. And that's how we get this Dubois connection. So Dubois is actually one of the first people that Ethel's father asked to come and speak to the NAACP. So as Ethel's growing up, she kind of has this mentor in the background of W.E.B. Du Bois, and talk about her as she's growing up. In 1918, she becomes the stenographer for the Minnesota Forest Fire Committee Relief headquarters. So in 1918, wildfires ravaged Cloquet, Duluth, and Moose Lake area. Um, And again, a stenographer, someone who takes shorthand. So she was definitely doing office work in this much needed um, relief program for uh, people who had been affected by the wildfires. And there is a book, I forget the name now, but maybe again, it's something I can share through email. But there's a book about this period in Minnesota history where these wildfires were devastating the area. Um, and and on to her next achievement. In 1923, she became the Minnesota State Legislature's first black stenographer. So this gets the attention of the black media in Minnesota and nationally as well. Um, to and again, kind of fitting in this town to 10th right, someone who was going to uplift themselves and then help uplift the race, quote unquote. So this, again, like I said, gets attention in the black media, and people start reaching out to her. And one of those organizations was the Kansas City Urban League, which she would go work for a while. And eventually, she would even go to Harlem in New York, where she worked around notable Harlem Renaissance artists before returning to Minnesota in 1926. So she moves around a little bit, and we're not going to worry about her timeline too much because we're going to talk about Minnesota stuff. But in 1926, she became the assistant head residence of the Phyllis Wheatley home. So, for those of you who might not be familiar, I'm going to give you a quick background on the Phyllis Wheatley home. So, this Phyllis Wheatley was a settlement house. So, in the early 20th century, settlement homes were kind of a social experiment um, in which we brought wealthy or upper class Americans, usually white women, into poorer neighborhoods to offer economic social assistance. So we were kind of doing this thing where it was kind of foreign putting people who are used to having a lot into neighborhoods that were disadvantaged. And that's a different subject, but ultimately settlement homes didn't always work. And Phil Sweetley Home, which still exists, initially had a whiteboard, but eventually did have a black director. So they opened their doors in 1924 with the primary goal of providing social services to the growing number of black transplants, especially um, during the Great Migration to Minnesota. They offered recreational programming later to children in the neighborhood, black children, and they also hosted black speakers and entertainers because Minneapolis did practice racial segregation when it came to hotels. Um, Dubois even stayed at the Phyllis Wheatley home when he couldn't find lodging here. And Marian Anderson, the famous contralto, she stayed at Phyllis Wheatley home as well. And there's kind of an incident that happened with her in the Dykeman Hotel. They denied her accommodations, and Phyllis Wheatley helped her stage a protest as well. Probably super interesting to you guys. Maybe I thought this was kind of very interesting when I learned about Ethel. Is she essentially becomes Minneapolis's first black policewoman. So, through her Phyllis Wheatley connections, she was assigned to the Women's Bureau of Minneapolis Police Department. So, according to Ethel, and this is a quote, she, quote, had the power to arrest, and her duties covered runaways in dance halls and then crimes against children. So, usually, again, black children or dance halls that were black. And there were only three of us, she says, for the whole city of Minneapolis, so it kept us quite busy. She often answered calls outside of the quote unquote Negro complaints due to the short staff that the Women's Bureau of Minneapolis had. So she was initially dealing with quote unquote Negro problems, but eventually had to deal with everything that they tried to assign her to within the Women's Bureau. And then probably most importantly for what we're talking about, she worked as a secretary for Dubois when he was a consultant for the American delegation of the founding of the United Nations in San Francisco. So again, that's just a hint of how highly he thinks of Ethel. And as kind of a way to highlight that, I'm going to read a letter to Ethel from Dubois. So in January 31st, 1923, Dubois writes, "My dear Ethel May Ray, I'm glad to hear of your appointment because I'm sure St. Paul is a more interesting place than Moose Lake." So a little dig there. "Have you quite given up your idea of going to college? I hope not. I'm always glad to have a word from you. Very sincerely yours, WEBD." So a few things going on in that letter. One, Dubois again is congratulating her, and that appointment he was talking about was the stenographer appointment. So she goes to the legislature in St. Paul from the forest fireworks she was doing in Moose Lake. So again, he seems like Dubois has this kind of view of Moose Lake is maybe not very happening, and I'm sure wasn't in 1923. Hello, anyone from Moose Lake. And then the other thing to really again pivot back to is this one line, "Have you quite given up your idea of going to college?" So there's two things going on that I see anyway there. And one is that it's really important how Nellie progresses in the world to Dubois because, again, since from a teenager in his work with Ethel's father, he's worried about her future. And again, for him at this time, he's fitting it into the talented tenth of people who are going to be responsible for the uplift are people who are educated. Um, the next letter I'm going to read to you is actually not from Dubois, it's from Dubois' secretary, but it highlights a couple of things. So this is from September 17th, 1926, and it reads, "My dear Miss Ray, during the summer, Dr. Dubois again asked you to join us in this work. I'm waiting to ask your decision in the matter. We both hope you have decided to come to the crisis. Dr. Dubois will be back in this country early in October and will need you immediately. Please let me hear from you in this matter. With kindest regards to your parents and best wishes to you, I am sincerely yours." So it seems like from this letter to Ethel in 1926, Dubois had been asking Ethel to come in on some capacity as at the crisis. Again, when we talk about how this was the organ, the speaking piece, the magazine for the NAACP, it's clear that as Ethel was navigating the world, Dubois wanted to find her a home, wanted to find her some work that he felt fit into our most critical, pressing issue, and that's racial equality in the early 20th century. So again, he thought very highly of Ethel. And if you look through those letters, which I'll send everyone a link, they had more of a correspondence than Nellie. So with that, I'm going to wrap up. But just wanted to focus on those parallels. So Nellie is a little bit more socially connected, a little bit more respectability politics. And it seems like with Ethel, he was trying to groom her for that. But if you actually read Ethel's oral history, you'll see her life was very different and did not take a straight path. She's a very interesting person. And to wrap up on these people's lives, so we'll start with William Francis, Nellie's husband. He dies of yellow fever in Monrovia in 1929. His body is sent back to St. Paul for a funeral at Pilgrim Baptist, which a lot of you know as the historic church in Rondo. Nellie moves back to Tennessee and then she died in 1926. Um, Ethel dies in 1922 after finally getting her bachelor's degree in 1978. And Dubois moves to Ghana in 1961 after officially joining the Communist Party. So he became, by the end of his life, he became disillusioned with American politics, with American life in terms of racial segregation, and he actually died in Ghana in August in 1963. Um, so again, I hope this really served as an introduction to Nellie and Ethel's lives, and to start to try to uncover some of these silenced voices. So we talk about Women's History Month, but to not just look nationally, but to look locally as well. And sometimes we may be surprised to see some of these people were talking to some of the biggest voices we've ever seen in this country. Um, so I want to thank you guys. Hello, this is me. I want to thank you all for joining. Um, and taking the time on this rainy day to join us, and again being here virtually. uh let's do a Q&A really quickly. I know that kind of ran a little long. Um so if you want to type a question in the live chat, definitely go ahead and do that, and I'll take a look out for those as you guys are typing. Just want to mention that this is a nonprofit, so if you guys would like to think about donating, that would be great. I had it up on that previous slide, and I can go back in a bit. Someone asked, "Will this be published as a recording?" Yeah, it's something we can definitely do. So probably do that within the next month or so and try to get that done. Um, but again, if you want to take a look at our website, www.aaicmn.org, you can definitely send us a donation if you want there. So far, I'm not getting any questions. It might be a technical issue thing. Um, I want to thank you guys for tuning in. I'm sorry the original link did not work. So I'm glad you guys were able to navigate to the channel. I do see the comment about having the audio was kind of a problem in the beginning. So I hope that sorted out. Looks like someone else was fine. Um, so with that, I don't see any questions. Let's definitely say if we're going to publish this in a few months or so, maybe you guys can definitely send us um, questions through our email, and we can see if we could somehow do it that way. But anyways, thank you guys for joining us. This year we're going to be working on some new exhibits. With COVID-19, I'm not sure the deadlines anymore, but I want to thank you for joining us and hope you all stay safe out there. Thank